The aircraft is already established in cruise. There is no turbulence, no visible instability, only the steady, continuous motion of a machine operating exactly as designed. Outside, the night is complete. There is no horizon, only a uniform darkness broken occasionally by distant, diffuse light from cloud tops far below. The sky above is equally opaque. Stars are absent. The aircraft exists in a narrow corridor of controlled isolation, suspended between layers of atmosphere that offer no visual reference. Inside the cockpit, the environment is dim. Instrument panels provide the only consistent illumination, soft, deliberate, and calibrated to preserve night vision. Digital readouts remain stable. Airspeed, altitude, heading, engine parameters, all within expected ranges. The autopilot is engaged. Flight directives remain centered. The aircraft is following its programmed route precisely. There are no warnings, no oral alerts, no system messages, nothing that would suggest deviation from normal operation. Far ahead, beyond what the human eye can detect, a weather system is forming structure. It is not violent, not yet, but it is laid. Thin stratified cloud begins to give way to denser formations. Moisture content increases gradually. Ice crystals accumulate at altitude, microscopic at first, then more concentrated. To onboard radar, it appears as a subtle return. Not a threat, not a deviation trigger, just a region of slightly elevated reflectivity, well within acceptable limits. The aircraft continues. Time passes without event. Minutes compress into routine. Minor course corrections occur automatically, commanded not by human input but by the flight management system, refining its path along invisible waypoints. Each adjustment is smooth, unnoticeable without deliberate observation. The aircraft remains stable, but stability in aviation is often conditional. At altitude, environmental margins are narrow. Small variations, temperature, pressure, particulate density, can begin to influence sensor behavior long before they influence aircraft performance. The first indication is not a warning. It is a discrepancy, a minor divergence between data sources, so small it remains within tolerance. Airspeed indications fluctuate by a fraction. Not enough to trigger a fault, not enough to demand attention. But present, inside the cockpit, the displays continue to present a coherent picture. Nothing appears incorrect, but the system is now reconciling slightly mismatched inputs. Multiple sensors feed the same parameters. When they disagree, even subtly, the aircraft's logic begins to prioritize, filter, and validate. This process is silent, invisible. It does not alert the crew. The aircraft enters a region of colder air. The transition is gradual, but its effects are not entirely uniform. Moisture content changes. Ice formation potential increases. Pitot probes, mounted externally, exposed directly to airflow, continue to measure dynamic pressure. They are heated, protected, designed for these conditions. But protection is not absolute. The discrepancy grows, still small, still within limits, but now persistent. One source indicates a slightly different airspeed than another. The difference is not large enough to disengage automation. Not yet. The autopilot remains engaged. But beneath that stability, logic pathways begin to shift. No alarm sound. No immediate action is required. From the perspective of the system, the situation is still manageable. From the perspective of the crew, nothing has changed. Outside, the aircraft moves deep into the atmospheric layer. Cloud density increases. Visibility drops to zero. There is no external reference, only instruments. In modern aviation, this is routine. Aircraft are designed to operate without visual cues. Pilots are trained to rely entirely on instrument data. But that reliance assumes one condition. that the data remains consistent. The first subtle transition occurs without announcement. A protective system begins to monitor the disagreement more closely. Thresholds are approached, not exceeded, but approached. The aircraft is now operating closer to a boundary. The autopilot continues to fly, smooth, precise, unaware of anything beyond its program parameters. But automation depends on data integrity, and data integrity is no longer perfectly aligned. Seconds pass, then more. Still no alert, still no visible instability. But the margin has narrowed. At high altitude, there's little room for error. Speed margins compress. The difference between safe flight and aerodynamic instability becomes smaller than at lower levels. Aircraft operate within a defined envelope, and that envelope is now being interpreted through slightly conflicting inputs. Inside the cockpit, everything appears normal, but normality in aviation is often a function of what is not yet visible. The system reaches a decision point. It has not failed, but it is no longer fully confident. And in that uncertainty, the first layer of protection prepares to respond. Silently, instantly, without negotiation, the aircraft continues forward, unaware that the conditions required for stable, predictable flight are beginning to shift beneath it. The flight was not unusual. It was one of thousands conducted daily across a global aviation network that has, over decades, refined itself into a system defined by precision, predictability, and layered redundancy. Routes are optimized, procedures standardized, variability minimized wherever possible. This particular operation fit neatly within that framework. A scheduled commercial flight, operating under instrument flight rules, connecting two major urban centers separated by several hundred nautical miles. The route was well established, frequented by both domestic and international carriers. Air traffic density along the corridor was moderate but controlled, supported by continuous radar coverage and structured airway design. There were no irregular notices filed prior to departure, no significant airspace restrictions, no severe weather advisories along the planned route. What existed instead was something more subtle. A forecast. Meteorological data indicated the presence of high-altitude moisture layers developing along portions of the airway. Not convective storms, not organized turbulence systems, but areas of supercooled water droplets, a known but often underestimated hazard in high-altitude flight. These conditions are not rare. They exist in a narrow band of temperature and pressure, where water remains liquid below freezing, invisible to the eye, often undetectable until encountered. When aircraft pass through such regions, these droplets can freeze rapidly on contact with exposed surfaces. Aircraft are designed for this. Anti-icing and de-icing systems protect critical components. Heating elements prevent accumulation on sensitive sensors. But the effectiveness of these systems depends on exposure limits, intensity, and duration. The aircraft assigned to the flight was a modern twin-engine jetliner, certified for high-altitude, long-range operations. Its design philosophy emphasized automation. Flight management systems controlled navigation. Autopilot systems maintained trajectory. Digital flight control laws interpreted pilot inputs and adjusted control surfaces accordingly. At cruise altitude, the aircraft required minimal manual intervention. The crew's role shifted from direct control to system oversight, monitoring, verifying, and intervening only when necessary. This is standard in contemporary aviation, but it introduces a subtle shift in workload dynamics. From active flying to supervisory management, the aircraft systems relied on a network of sensors. Among the most critical, pitot-static system measures airspeed through dynamic and static pressure. Angle of attack sensors determine airflow relative to wing orientation. Inertial reference systems track position and movement independent of external inputs. These systems feed data into the flight computers. From there, decisions are made. Automation is not autonomous. It is dependent. Maintenance records for the aircraft indicated no outstanding defects. All required inspections had been completed within prescribed intervals. No recurring faults had been logged in recent flights. However, like all complex systems, reliability does not imply immunity. Failures in modern aircraft are rarely the result of a single breakdown. They emerge from alignment. Multiple small factors, each individually manageable, combine in sequence. The crew assigned to the flight met all regulatory requirements. Both pilots were certified on type. Training records showed satisfactory performance across simulator evaluations, including abnormal procedures and system failures. Flight hours were within acceptable limits. Fatigue management protocols had been followed. Nothing in the documentation suggested elevated risk. Yet modern aviation incidents rarely originate from obvious deficiencies. They arise in environments where everything appears efficient. The route itself presented no terrain hazards at cruise altitude. Below, the landscape varied. Rural expanses, occasional elevated terrain, and scattered urban development. But at flight level, terrain clearance was not a concern. The risk, if any, existed not below, but within the atmosphere. Air traffic control communications throughout the early phase of the flight were routine. Clearances were issued and acknowledged without delay. Altitude and routing remained consistent with the flight plan. No deviations were requested. No urgency was expressed. From the perspective of the network, the aircraft was simply one of many, moving predictably through controlled airspace. In the broader industry context, attention in recent years had shifted toward automation dependency and data reliability. Investigations into past incidents had highlighted scenarios where crews were presented with conflicting information. Situations in which the aircraft itself remained capable, but the interpretation of its state became uncertain. Training programs had adapted. Pilots were taught to recognize unreliable indications. Procedures existed for isolating faulty data, but these procedures rely on recognition, and recognition depends on clarity. The environmental conditions forecast for this flight did not meet thresholds typically associated with immediate concern. There were no embedded thunderstorms, no severe icing advisories, no turbulence reports requiring rerouting. Only a mention, brief, technical, easily overlooked, of potential high-altitude icing layers. In isolation, such a condition is manageable. Aircraft encounter similar environments regularly. Systems are designed with these encounters in mind. But environmental factors do not act in isolation. They interact with design limits, with operational assumptions, with human expectations. The aircraft continued along its route. Cruise altitude maintained. Speed stable. Navigation precise. From every external perspective, the flight was progressing exactly as intended, inside the system. However, conditions were beginning to align. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily. A marginal environment, a sensor-dependent system, a crew operating in a supervisory role, automation functioning within narrowing tolerances. Individually, none of these elements represent danger. Together, they begin to form a chain. At this stage, the chain remains incomplete. No link has failed, but the structure is present. And as the aircraft moves deeper into the atmosphere, toward conditions that are not fully visible, the system that sustains its stability becomes increasingly reliant on something fragile. Consistency. Complex aviation events are rarely defined by a single failure. They emerge through interaction between machine logic, human interpretation, and environmental influence. Each domain operates within its own limits, but those limits are not fixed. They shift under pressure, under ambiguity, and under conditions that are not always immediately visible. To understand the trajectory of this flight, each angle must be examined independently, and then, together. 1. Aircraft systems. At cruise altitude, the aircraft operates within a narrow aerodynamic envelope. Air density is low. Engine performance is optimized for efficiency, not excess thrust. Speed margins between stall and overspeed are compressed. Under these conditions, precise data becomes critical. The aircraft's pedostatic system measures airspeed using differential pressure. Heated probes extend into the airflow, continuously sampling dynamic pressure. This data is fed into air data computers, which calculate indicated airspeed and relay it to both the flight deck and the flight control systems. Redundancy exists. Multiple probes, independent processing channels, cross-checking logic. But redundancy does not eliminate disagreement. It manages it. When sensor inputs begin to diverge, the system attempts reconciliation. If one value differs slightly, it may be filtered. If disagreement increases, the system may isolate the outlier. If confidence drops below a defined threshold, automation begins to degrade. Not fail, degrade. The autopilot relies on consistent airspeed data to maintain stable flight. Pitch, thrust, and trim adjustments are calculated based on that input. When the data becomes unreliable, the autopilot cannot guarantee stability within programmed limits. In such cases, the system is designed to disconnect. This is not an error. It is a protection. Simultaneously, flight control laws may shift. Modern aircraft do not respond directly to control inputs in a purely mechanical sense. Instead, computers interpret pilot commands within a framework of protections, preventing excessive pitch, limiting bank angle, maintaining safe speed margins. But these protections are conditional. They rely on valid data. When data becomes unreliable, certain protections are reduced or removed entirely. The aircraft transitions from a protected system to one requiring direct, precise human control. This transition is abrupt and often unanticipated. 2. Crew. The flight crew operates within a structured environment of procedures and expectations. Training emphasizes recognition of abnormal conditions. Checklists exist for unreliable airspeed. Protocols define immediate actions. But recognition is not always immediate. In high-altitude crews, workload is low. The aircraft is stable. Automation is engaged. Monitoring becomes passive. This is not complacency. It is design. When a disruption occurs, the shift in workload is immediate. From monitoring to active control. From stable to ambiguous. Human cognition under such conditions is influenced by expectation. If the aircraft appears stable, initial anomalies may be interpreted as transient. If indications conflict, the brain seeks consistency, favoring the data that aligns with prior understanding. This is known as confirmation bias. It is not an error. It is a human tendency. Crew resource management, CRM, is designed to mitigate this. Cross-verification, challenge and response communication, shared situational awareness. But CRM depends on clarity. When both pilots receive conflicting information, alignment becomes more difficult. Time is also a factor. At high altitude, changes in aircraft state can develop rapidly once stability is compromised. The window for correct interpretation is limited. Free environment. The atmospheric conditions along the flight path were not extreme, but they were precise. High-altitude icing differs from conventional icing. It does not always produce visible accumulation. It may not trigger immediate system alerts. It affects sensors before structures. Supercooled water droplets, when encountered at speed, can freeze upon impact. Pitot probes are heated, but under certain conditions, particularly when exposure is sustained or droplet density increases, The heating capacity may be challenged, not overwhelmed, but tested. The result is not immediate blockage. It is partial interference. Pressure readings fluctuate. Airflow sampling becomes inconsistent. Simultaneously, the aircraft is operating in cloud. No visual horizon. No external reference. Everything depends on instrumentation. The absence of visual cues removes a layer of redundancy. Pilots cannot cross-check attitude visually. They cannot sense subtle deviations through external reference. They rely entirely on what the aircraft tells them. 4. Operational pressure. There was no declared emergency, no immediate external pressure, but operational context always exists. Flights operate on schedules. Airspace is structured. Deviations, while allowed, introduce complexity. When encountering marginal conditions, crews must make decisions, continue through, deviate around, adjust altitude. Each decision carries implications. Fuel consumption, traffic separation, timing. In this case, conditions did not initially justify deviation. There was no clear hazard, only a gradual change in environment. And so, the aircraft continued. Convergence. Individually, each factor remains manageable. A sense of discrepancy, a marginal icing layer, a highly automated aircraft, a trained, qualified crew. But aviation accidents do not occur in isolation. They occur when factors align. A sensor begins to provide inconsistent data. Automation, dependent on that data, begins to lose confidence. The environment removes external references. The crew, presented with subtle anomalies, must interpret before acting. No single element fails completely, but each begins to degrade. The system is still functioning. The aircraft is still flying. The crew is still in control. But the margin, the space between stability and instability, has narrowed. And within that narrowing margin, timing becomes critical. The transition begins without warning. There is no gradual escalation, no progressive alert sequence, only a moment, precise, instantaneous, where system confidence drops below a defined threshold. The autopilot disconnects. A single, distinct oral tone sounds in the cockpit. Short, recognizable, routine in isolation. But here, it marks a shift. Control transfers from automated systems to the flight crew. At the same time, the flight directors, previously stable, centered, either disappear or present commands based on degraded data. The visual guidance that had quietly maintained the aircraft's trajectory is no longer reliable. The aircraft is still stable, but now, stability must be maintained manually. Airspeed indications begin to diverge. One display shows a gradual decrease. Another remains steady. A third fluctuates within a narrow band. None of the values immediately indicate danger, but they no longer agree. The flight control system responds accordingly. Certain protections are reduced. The aircraft transitions from a fully protected flight envelope to a more direct control mode, one in which pilot input has greater authority, but less automated limitation. This is not announced in detail. It is indicated subtly through changes in system behavior. The crew is now presented with a developing problem. Unreliable airspeed. Procedure dictates immediate actions. Maintain pitch and thrust settings appropriate for the current phase of flight. Stabilize the aircraft based on known performance parameters, not on potentially faulty indications. But recognition requires certainty, and certainty is not immediate. The aircraft begins a slight pitch adjustment, small at first, a response, either to perceived speed decay or to an attempt to maintain altitude under uncertain conditions. Engine thrust increases, again, subtly. At high altitude, these changes carry amplified consequences. The margin between stall speed and overspeed is narrow. Excessive pitch reduces airspeed rapidly. Excessive thrust, combined with incorrect pitch, can destabilize the aircraft's energy state. Without reliable airspeed, the relationship between pitch, power, and performance becomes harder to interpret. The aircraft climbs slightly, uncommanded in intention, but not in input, a natural result of increased pitch. Altitude increases. Airspeed, on at least one display, continues to decrease. The aircraft is now approaching the upper boundary of its performance envelope. This region is often referred to as a coffin corner, where stall speed and maximum operating speed converge. There is little tolerance here. Control inputs become more pronounced. The aircraft's nose is raised further. Whether in response to perceived descent or misinterpreted data, the effect is the same. Angle of attack increases. Angle of attack, the angle between the wing and the oncoming airflow, is critical. Beyond a certain threshold, lift begins to decrease, not increase. The aircraft approaches that threshold. Warnings may begin to activate. Intermittent at first, not continuous, because the system itself is working with conflicting data. The stall warning triggers, then stops, then triggers again. This inconsistency complicates interpretation. Is the aircraft actually approaching a stall, or is the warning itself unreliable? In the absence of clear, consistent information, decision-making becomes fragmented. The aircraft's pitch remains elevated. Thrust is high, but airspeed, true airspeed, continues to decay. Lift decreases. The aircraft reaches a critical angle of attack. At this point, aerodynamic behavior changes. The airflow over the wings separates. Lift is no longer sufficient to maintain altitude. The stall begins. The nose should be lowered. This is the fundamental recovery principle. Reduce angle of attack, but recognition is delayed, or conflicted. Control inputs do not immediately align with recovery procedures. Instead of reducing pitch, inputs may momentarily maintain or even increase it, driven by the perception of altitude loss or misinterpreted speed. The stall deepens. The aircraft begins to descend. Initially, the descent rate is moderate. Then it increases. Bank angle may develop. Uncoordinated inputs. Asymmetry in airflow. The aircraft is no longer in stable flight. Recovery remains possible, but it requires correct interpretation. Immediate, decisive action. Time is limited. Altitude decreases. Rapidly now. The aircraft passes through cloud layers. Still no external reference. Still no horizon. Instrument data remains inconsistent. The descent continues. At lower altitude, air density increases. Control authority improves, but only if the correct inputs are applied. If not, the aircraft remains outside its optimal flight envelope. The final moments are defined not by a single failure, but by the absence of alignment between data, interpretation, action. The aircraft, still structurally intact, still responsive in principle, continues its descent until recovery is no longer achievable within the available altitude. Impact follows. There is no explosion described, no dramatization, only the conclusion of a sequence that began minutes earlier, quietly, invisibly, within the margins of a system that depended on consistency. The aircraft disappears from radar in a manner that is not abrupt, but final. There is no distress call recorded in the final moments. No extended emergency transmission. Only the gradual loss of altitude data, followed by the absence of a transponder signal. For air traffic control, the change is subtle at first. A descent rate that exceeds expectation. A return that no longer aligns with assigned altitude. Attempts to re-establish contact begin immediately. Standard phraseology. Repeated calls. No response. Search and rescue protocols are initiated within minutes. The last known position, derived from radar data and flight tracking, is used to define a search area. Its size depends on altitude, speed, and the final recorded trajectory. In this case, the descent profile suggests a high-energy event. The projected impact zone is relatively contained. The wreckage is located within hours. There is no indication of in-flight breakup. Debris is concentrated. This pattern suggests that the aircraft remained structurally intact until impact. Initial observations are methodical. Rescue teams secure the area. Investigators begin documentation. Every fragment is part of a larger narrative. Position, orientation, distribution. The recovery of the flight data recorder, FDR, and cockpit voice recorder, CVR, becomes the immediate priority. Both devices are designed to withstand extreme conditions. Impact forces, fire exposure, submersion. They are located, damaged externally, but intact. Once recovered, they are transported to a specialized facility. Data extraction begins. The flight data recorder provides a continuous record of aircraft parameters, airspeed from multiple sources, altitude, pitch, roll, and yaw, engine thrust settings, autopilot status, control inputs. The timeline begins to reconstruct itself. Data shows the moment of autopilot disengagement, a clear transition from stable, automated flight to manual control. Shortly after, discrepancies in airspeed inputs are recorded, multiple sensors providing conflicting values. The aircraft's response becomes evident. Pitch increases, thrust rises, altitude climbs slightly, then a gradual decay in actual airspeed, correlated through independent parameters such as angle of attack and inertial data. The cockpit voice recorder adds context, not through dramatization, but through timing. Audio reveals the initial recognition of abnormal indications, references to airspeed, uncertainty. There is no panic, only increasing workload. Checklist references may be present, but fragmented. The sequence progresses quickly, from recognition to interpretation to action. The stall warning is captured, intermittent, repeated. Control inputs reflect attempts to manage the aircraft, but they do not consistently align with standard stall recovery procedures. This is not negligence. It is misinterpretation under ambiguity. Investigators analyze the data in parallel with system design. The pitot-static system becomes a focal point. Examination of recovered components reveals evidence consistent with temporary obstruction or interference. Not permanent failure, not structural damage, but conditions that would produce unreliable pressure readings. Meteorological analysis confirms the presence of high-altitude icing conditions along the flight path. Satellite data, weather models, reports from nearby aircraft. The environment, while not extreme, was sufficient to challenge sensor performance. Attention shifts to system behavior. Why did the autopilot disconnect? Because data confidence dropped below acceptable thresholds. Why were protections reduced? Because the system could no longer verify safe operating limits with certainty. Why was recovery not achieved? Because the crew did not receive consistent, reliable information, and therefore could not accurately interpret the aircraft's energy state in time. The investigation does not identify a single point of failure. Instead, it defines a chain. Exposure to high-altitude icing conditions, degradation of airspeed data accuracy, autopilot disengagement, transition to manual control under ambiguous indications, misinterpretation of aircraft state, inappropriate control inputs relative to actual conditions, aerodynamic stall at high altitude, incomplete recovery. Each link is individually survivable. Together, they become irreversible. Regulatory authorities review the findings. Manufacturers analyze system responses. Airlines examine training procedures. The focus is not on blame, It is on understanding. Advisories are issued. Recommendations may include enhanced training for unreliable airspeed scenarios, emphasis on pitch and power memory procedures, improved sensor heating or redundancy logic, refinement of stall warning behavior under conflicting data conditions. The accident becomes part of a broader dataset, not isolated, but connected to similar events across modern aviation history. Patterns are identified, not identical, but consistent. Automation dependency, data reliability, human interpretation under uncertainty. The investigation concludes not with a single answer, but with a structured understanding of how a modern aircraft, fully functional in design, can still be lost when critical information becomes uncertain at the wrong moment. In aviation, accidents do not end at impact. They continue in analysis, in procedure, and in the quiet integration of lessons that reshape how flight is conducted. The loss of this aircraft did not reveal a hidden flaw in a single component. It revealed a vulnerability in interaction between data and interpretation, between automation and expectation, between system design and human response under uncertainty. Modern aircraft are built with layers of protection, redundancy in sensors, logic in automation, training in abnormal scenarios. Each layer is designed to prevent escalation, but no system is absolute. The investigation clarified a fundamental reality. Automation is only as reliable as the data it receives. When the data becomes inconsistent, automation does not fail, it withdraws. And in that withdrawal, responsibility returns fully to the crew. This transition is critical, not because it is rare, but because it is abrupt. Following the accident, emphasis shifted toward improving this transition. Training programs were revised. Pilots are now more extensively trained to recognize unreliable airspeed conditions not as isolated anomalies, but as immediate, high-priority events requiring decisive action. Memory-based procedures, pitch and thrust settings, are reinforced, not as secondary tools, but as primary responses when data cannot be trusted. Simulator scenarios evolved. Instead of predictable failures, crews are exposed to ambiguous, conflicting inputs designed to replicate the uncertainty experienced in real conditions. The goal is not memorization. It is recognition. Aircraft manufacturers also reviewed system behavior. Particular attention was given to how information is presented during data disagreement. Clarity became a priority. Where multiple airspeed sources diverge, systems are refined to highlight disagreement more distinctly, reduce ambiguity in warning logic, provide clearer cues for required action. Sensor technology is also examined. Enhancements to pitot heating performance, evaluation of probe placement, improved resistance to high-altitude icing conditions. None of these changes represent a complete solution. They are incremental. But aviation safety is built on increments. Regulatory bodies incorporate findings into guidance material. Airlines update operational manuals. Checklists are revised, not in structure, but in emphasis. The principle remains unchanged. When instrumentation becomes unreliable, control must be based on known aerodynamic relationships, not displayed values. This is not new knowledge. It is foundational, but events such as this reinforce its importance. Beyond technical adjustments, the accident contributes to a broader understanding of human factors. Under conditions of uncertainty, the mind seeks consistency. Conflicting data delays action. Time compresses. Training now addresses these realities more directly, not by eliminating uncertainty, but by preparing for it. The legacy of the flight is not defined by the failure chain alone. It is defined by what changes because of it. Procedures become sharper. Systems become clearer. Awareness becomes deeper. And future crews, facing similar conditions, operate with a slightly improved margin. The aircraft itself, in its final moments, remained capable of flight. Its systems functioned within their design limits. Its structure remained intact. What was lost was alignment. Alignment between what the aircraft was doing and what it appeared to be doing. In aviation, that distinction is critical. The sky offers no forgiveness for uncertainty, only space. And within that space, safety depends not on perfection, but on the continuous refinement of understanding. This accident becomes part of that refinement, not as an isolated event, but as a reference, quietly integrated, rarely visible, but present in every procedure, every training session, every system designed to ensure that when uncertainty emerges again, it is recognized sooner, interpreted correctly, and resolved in time.